Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome to the fourth week of today's Tolkien Times. I'm Alan, the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and the TTT is my way of bringing you a little Middle-earth every single day. Now, if you want even more content, be sure to listen to the award-winning Prancing Pony podcast, now approaching the end of our 7th season. But for now, folks, it's time to get started with this week and Mailbag Monday. Now, today we're answering a question from Jack about the Rammas Ecor. That's the wall surrounding the Pelennor outside of Minas Tirith. The question is simple. When was it really built? The answer is less simple than it sounds. So in Book 5, Chapter 1, Minas Tirith, when Gandalf and Pippin finish their chat with Ingold at the wall, we read this. Gandalf passed now into the wide lands beyond the Rammas Ecor. So the men of Gondor called the outwall that they had built with great labor after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy. No specific date is given, and so we're left with this vague answer. But then we add to that what Hammond and Skull say in their Reader's Companion. In his unfinished index, Tolkien says that the Rammas was built under Denethor's lordship, which would explain his reluctance to abandon it. Okay, so when we covered that part of the chapter on the PPP in episode 264 last fall, we concluded that the line, after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy, must have referred to Third Age 2954. That's 3 years after Sauron openly declared himself in Mordor and began rebuilding Barad-dûr. In that year, Mount Doom erupted, and, the Tale of Years tells us, the last inhabitants of Ithilien flee over Anduin. Now, in fact, at that point, I had not discovered the bit in the unfinished index about it being built under Denethor's leadership. And since Denethor's father, Ecthelion II, was the ruling steward at the time of Ithilien's fall, we argued that it must have been built under his leadership about 70 years before the events of the Return of the King. But if it was constructed under Denethor, well, then it couldn't have been built until 2984 when he became steward, which, granted, is still after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy. So we're all good, right? Except, that's only 35 years before the events of this story. So how is the wall in such ruinous condition? Well, before the bit from the unfinished index was made known, all we had was after Ithilien fell under the shadow of their enemy, and that could actually refer to a pretty wide range of times. For example, the Black Uruks attacked out of Mordor for the first time in 2901, conquering Ithilien and part of Osgiliath, and that would make the wall over 100 years old at this time, so that might explain it. Still, it's a stone wall. 118 years shouldn't result in that amount of ruin. But it could even have been referring to the fall of Minas Ithil in 2002, which would make the wall over 1,000 years old. Wow. Well, lots to choose from. What about other sources? What do they say? Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth says that it was built around the Pelennor by steward Ecthelion II after the desertion of Ithilien in Third Age 2954. Okay, well that goes along with what we said on the PPP, but what else? The online wiki, the Encyclopedia of Arda, takes the shadow line, combines it with the unfinished index bit about Denethor, and concludes 2984, bringing us back to that 35-year-old crumbling stone wall again. But there is an answer that fits both Ithilien falling under the shadow and the Denethor part that also makes more sense with the crumbling wall. For that, we're going to look into the appendices. But first, do you remember when I mentioned the attacks of the Uruks in 2901? The Tale of Years says that's when most of the remaining inhabitants of Ithilien deserted owing to the attacks of Uruks of Mordor. It's also the year when Heneth Anun was built, but that's another Mailbag Monday. Still, here's the thing. 2901 wasn't the first time the Uruks attacked. In Appendix A, we read this. In the last years of Denethor I, the race of Uruks, black orcs of great strength, first appeared out of Mordor. And in 2475, they swept across Ithilien and took Osgiliath. Boromir, son of Denethor, after whom Boromir of the Nine Walkers was later named, defeated them and regained Ithilien. But Osgiliath was finally ruined, and its great stone bridge was broken. No people dwelt there afterwards. Now, certainly, one could argue that Ithilien had at that point fallen under the shadow, especially with Osgiliath being finally destroyed. More importantly, it fits Tolkien's description from his unfinished index that it was built during the stewardship of a Denethor. but Denethor I, not our perpetual Father of the Year candidate, Denethor II. Given all of these factors, I believe the answer that fits the best is that Denethor I is the one who built the Ramas Echor. Denethor I ruled from 2435 to 2477, and so he died only 2 years after the loss of Osgiliath. So really the bulk of it was most likely completed under his son's stewardship. But that would put the wall at around 540 years old by the time of the War of the Ring, accounting for its crumbling stature, fitting the text of it being built after Ithilien fell into the shadow, and also fitting Tolkien's mention of Denethor. Now, it makes sense from a real-world historical position as well. At that point, Gondor had experienced over 400 years of peace. The Watchful Peace began in 2063. So to have that attack all at once kind of changes the picture. So building an outwall to protect the rich farmlands and towns of the Pelennor that had built up over that time, that's a very logical decision in the face of such an event. And interestingly, it has a bit of real-world analogy as well, if you don't mind some stretching. In a number of places, especially in the letters, Tolkien has compared Gondor to the real-world Byzantine Empire. Now, they also built something very much like the Ramas, called the Anastasian Wall, back in the 6th century or so. It was 35 miles long. The Ramas was over 10 leagues in length, so over 30 miles, similar length, and was built to defend against raids and barbarians, as well as to provide a bit of a speed bump against any large army with siege engines coming to take Constantinople. Not Istanbul, and I hear They Might Be Giants song. How about you? And like the Ramas, that proved difficult to defend because of its length. Now, it wasn't a circle. It was a straight line, mostly north-south to the west of Istanbul, but still, same kind of length and the same problem. So, Ramas was most likely built under the stewardship of a Denethor, but Denethor I, making the wall over 500 years old by the time Gandalf and Pippin arrive in the first chapter of Book 5. Now, folks, that wraps it up for today's Mailbag Monday. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. But be sure to let him know that it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it soon. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday, as we learn more about the professor himself. As always, please like and subscribe on YouTube, follow or subscribe on your podcast apps to make sure each episode gets downloaded to your device, and follow @Tolkien Times on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.